It was just past midnight when Eric stepped onto the bus, weary and desperate for a moment of peace. The day had been long and punishing. His boss had piled deadlines onto his shoulders, clients had shouted down the phone, and his co-workers had retreated behind polite smiles that offered no real support. Now, with the city's neon lights reflecting in dark puddles and the sharp scent of rain in the air, Eric yearned only for quiet. He wanted to sink into a plastic seat and let the engine's low hum lull his racing mind. As he passed the driver, an older man who gave him a curt nod, Eric noted that the bus was nearly empty. There were just a few scattered passengers, a couple hunched together near the back, staring at their phones. And in the middle rows, an old lady seated alone near the aisle. She wore a faded grey overcoat, her shoulders wrapped in a knitted shawl, and on her head perched a small hat from another era. Something about her posture, head slightly bent, hands clasped in her lap, suggested she might have been riding this route for decades. Possibly she was homeless, or lonely, or simply accustomed to travelling at odd hours. Eric didn't think much of it. He just needed a seat. He settled into one, a row or two ahead of her, on the opposite side, and leaned his head back against the high seat. The bus jerked away from the curb with a hiss of hydraulics. Outside, the city's distant roar and sparkling billboards formed a blurred tapestry. But Eric focused inward, trying to calm the pounding in his skull. He closed his eyes. That's when he heard something breaking through the sputtering of the bus. A low, persistent muttering. At first, the sound barely registered. Just a gentle whisper merging with the engine's rumble. But as the seconds passed, he could discern words, or rather, numbers. 98, 98, 98. It was the old lady. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. But the words she repeated carried clearly across the empty space. Eric cracked an eye open, hoping she might stop. Instead, the chant continued, steady and unbroken. She just kept saying 98, over and over. Eric tried to ignore it. Maybe she had dementia, or maybe she was counting something he couldn't see. On another night, with more patience, he might have felt pity. But not tonight. He was stretched too thin, his nerves too raw. He let out a slow breath and turned his head away, willing himself to focus on his own thoughts. He tried to recall a pleasant memory, dinner with friends, a quiet morning walk. But the muttering sliced through his attempts like a dull blade. She continued in earnest. His jaw tightened. Fine, he thought. Just endure. The bus would reach its stop soon enough, and he'd never have to see her again. He put his earbuds in, though he had no music playing. Just a barrier. Something to tell the world he was off limits. He closed his eyes and tried to drift. Still, that voice. Despite the earbuds, her chant seemed to creep under his skin. Eric's shoulders tensed. The bus rattled over a pothole. and a fluorescent bulb overhead flickered. He hoped a change in the road's pitch might distract him, but nothing did. The old lady was relentless. 15 minutes in, Eric couldn't take it any longer. He pulled out the earbuds and turned slightly, casting a glance over his shoulder. The old lady sat quite still, hands folded on her lap, staring straight ahead. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly, but the sound was unmistakable. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him. Another 5 minutes passed, each second scraping at Eric's patience. He cleared his throat loudly, hoping to startle her out of it. No reaction. At last, frustration boiled over. He twisted in his seat. "Excuse me," he said, voice tighter than he intended. "Could you please stop that?" No response. She kept muttering. The couple at the back briefly looked up, and then back down at their phones, uninterested. "Madam," he tried again. "Could you stop saying, you know, that number?" The old lady continued, unchanged. 98, 98, 98. As if his words passed right through her. Eric's neck grew hot. Was she ignoring him on purpose? He needed quiet, just a sliver of peace. He'd dealt with enough aggravation all day. Why couldn't this simple request be granted? He turned fully around in his seat, resting an arm over the back. "Madam, I'm sorry to bother you, but could you please keep it down?" This time, he thought he saw a flicker in her eyes. But still, she said nothing else. Just repeating the same thing that she had for the last half an hour since he got on. Eric pressed his lips together. The bus jolted as it turned a corner. The street outside now empty, except for the occasional parked car. The driver seemed oblivious, focused on the road ahead. The old lady might be mentally ill, or just lost in her own world. He tried to summon some empathy, but his head ached, and he felt raw and exposed from the day's trials. "Why are you saying that?" he demanded. He kept his voice low but firm. "What does 98 mean?" No answer. Her voice barely shifted, as if she was a broken record stuck on the same groove. "Fine," Eric hissed to himself, turning back around. He rubbed his temples. This was ridiculous. He'd get off at the next stop, walk the rest of the way if he had to. Anything to escape this unnerving repetition. The bus slowed at a red light. The silence of the city at night pressed in. Eric tapped his foot, anxious now. He should be close to his stop, but it felt as if the bus was slowing down, dragging time out. The old lady's chant never wavered, never paused. He tried one last time. "Look, ma'am, I had a terrible day. Could you please just..." He clenched his fists. She gave no sign she heard him. It was infuriating, like shouting at a wall. "Stop it!" he burst out, louder than intended. His voice echoed in the quiet bus. The couple at the back looked up again, frowning. The old lady's chant continued. That was it. Eric stood up, ignoring the lurch in his stomach, and staggered down the aisle towards the driver's seat, The bus rumbled forward as the light turned green. "Driver," Eric said, trying to keep his tone even. "I need to get off at the next stop." The driver, a weary man with heavy-lidded eyes, nodded but said nothing. It was just another midnight shift for him. Eric returned to his seat, but couldn't bring himself to sit down again. He hovered there, staring at the old lady, anger building. He knew it was irrational. She wasn't hurting him. But the repetition had wormed into his brain, and now it represented everything that was wrong with his life. Endless demands, no relief, no understanding. "Stop," Eric said again, stepping closer to her. "I'm talking to you." She didn't flinch, didn't even glance his way. Just that maddening drone. The bus slowed, pulling towards a curb. The next stop, finally. Eric grabbed the overhead rail to steady himself. The door hissed open, letting in a cool breath of night air. He moved towards it, his heart pounding. He'd escape this madness, get some fresh air, maybe walk off the frustration. But at the threshold, something in him snapped. Maybe it was the knowledge that he'd never know what 98 meant, or that he was forced out of his route by a stranger's bizarre behaviour. Maybe the stress of the day had finally broken him. He turned one last time to the old lady, raising his voice. "I don't know what your deal is," he shouted, voice echoing in the stillness. "But you're driving me crazy. Why 98? Why?" She continued, as if he was invisible. 98, 98, 98. Her voice just as calm, just as steady. With a snarl of frustration, Eric stepped off the bus onto the darkened street. The doors hissed closed behind him, and he stepped forward, intending to make a dramatic gesture, maybe to shout one final time through the window. But as he whirled around to yell, he took one step too far off the curb, his attention solely on the old lady. Headlights flared in the corner of his vision, and a horn blared, shrill and frantic. He had time to gasp, maybe half a second of horror, before the car struck him full on. The impact was brutal, instantaneous. Eric's body was thrown backward, landing hard on the pavement. The driver screeched to a stop, but it was too late. In the bus, the old lady's voice finally ceased. The few passengers scrambled to the windows, horrified by what they saw. Outside, under a flickering streetlight, Eric lay unmoving. A small crowd would gather soon. Sirens would wail, and bystanders would murmur in shock and pity. Inside the bus, however, the old lady did not rise to look. She simply shifted in her seat, straightened her coat's collar, and began to mutter again. But this time, her voice carried a different number. Her lips moved slowly, enunciating with care. 99, 99, 99. Her tone was almost satisfied, as though she'd counted correctly and reached a new tally. The driver, stunned, hadn't started the bus again. The other passengers were glued to the windows. No one noticed how the old lady's eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of her hat, gleamed with quiet knowing. Outside, on the street, the city continued its endless churn. A life had been snuffed out. An innocent passerby had crossed the line at the wrong moment. People would say later he was distraught, that he was shouting at someone invisible. The driver would recall the old lady, but wouldn't remember her face clearly. Just that chant. The passengers would shuffle off at their stops, shaken, trying to forget the night's horror. But the old lady didn't do anything. It was just a horrible accident, the others would say. And as the bus eventually pulled away, vanishing down a darkened road, the old lady remained seated, muttering softly to herself. Her voice faded with the engine's hum, leaving only the echo of that new number trailing after her. No one would know what it meant. No one would ever discover how many times she'd done this, or why. But she would keep counting, quietly, relentlessly, marking each life with a whispered tally. Her voice drifting through midnight streets, waiting for the next unwitting soul who dared to demand an answer.